Welcome back here on Live Now from Fox, 9:18 on the East Coast and 6:18 on the West Coast. We continue to cover the latest here on the investigation that is ongoing over in New Orleans, specifically on the well-known Bourbon Street after a truck intentionally rammed into a crowd of people who were celebrating New Year's. This was according to police as they held that brief news conference we played for you a short time ago. Now, we do expect to learn much more during a news conference just about 3 hours from now. The FBI is in charge of this investigation, but what we know from police is that at least 10 people were killed and more than 30 others were injured, taken to various hospitals. Now, it is important to note that that number does not include people who may have been injured on the scene and refused hospital transport. That number not included. In this live image right here, you are looking at those coroner vans as all of Bourbon Street is blocked off, and police are urging everyone, whether you're a tourist or you live there, to avoid Bourbon Street as the investigation is ongoing. I do want to bring in a friend of the show here, Scott Duffy, retired FBI agent, to talk more about what we know and really what is still left to figure out. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, good morning, Josh. Thank you for having me on this morning.
And first off, just break down for me your initial thoughts as you're hearing all of this unfold. There's conflicting information coming in from various agencies involved. Tell me your overall thoughts as you really just try to process this.
Yeah, so day one of 2025, and we're dealing with another mass casualty event. Whether it be a terror event, a mass attack, whatever the motivation, the mindset of this individual remains to be determined. And so here we are again discussing yet another tragedy, a criminal act by somebody who intended to hurt as many people as possible. And we see through the whether it be the police chief, the mayors, the elected officials, et cetera, through press conferences and information that is being relayed to the public, that this was an intentional act. And that's important because this is not somebody who, at least from what we're learning in the early investigation, somebody who was intoxicated, somebody who mistakenly went down a one-way street and ran over people and stopped and then was taken into custody or et cetera. They are saying this was intentional because of the early pieces of evidence, I imagine. Somebody who accelerated that we're learning, somebody who probably went around barriers, and then, of course, what they're learning from what they've taken from the vehicle and everything that's unfolded since. So this is a criminal intended mass casualty attack, and that is way that the authorities are investigating it.
I did want to get your take on the statements that were made. The mayor of New Orleans walked up to the microphone, and the first thing she said was that New Orleans was hit by a terrorist attack. Then you had the FBI leading the investigation. They came up and said, whoa, we don't know just yet if this is a terrorist attack. They actually said this is not considered a terrorist event at this point. What do you make of that? Because again, we're talking about some conflicting information, but it is, of course, early on in the investigation. This just happened hours ago.
Yeah, so this is where you would typically, as we have seen in the past couple of years, where there is a unified message, and it's important that a unified message be presented. So we already know, at least from both sides, that being a federal and a local level, that this was an intentional act. It's not being investigated as an accident. And so then you get into, well, what was the intention or the motivation behind this act? Was it a mass attack? So you have mass shootings, and ultimately we try to get to the motivation of an individual, whether it be some sort of revenge, some sort of grudge, and thereby they must exact their pain on others. And so what is the motivation behind this individual who drove that vehicle into a crowd intending to do harm? Typically, we see that this is being investigated by the FBI or being investigated by the locals in with support of the FBI, with their crime scene, their evidence response teams, et cetera, and that this is being worked jointly, and that there is a joint unified message where you can say, "Hey, we're looking at all aspects of this to include a potential domestic." Or international terroristic act. So I'm a little surprised that we're not seeing that unified message, and I hope that the powers that be will be on the same page in the forthcoming press conference.
And kind of on that same note here, during the press conference, they have said the first one, they said no questions. They just kept it to, we're going to make our initial statements and that's it. Questions will be asked or allowed during the next news conference. What question or questions do you hope will be answered specifically during that news conference? You touched on that, but what else do you hope we'll get maybe a clearer picture of?
Well, I think there has to be a clarification. And so I would imagine at this next press conference that is going to be unified in the sense that you're going to see, like we have seen in many other unfortunate events like these, where you have both federal, state, and local, and as well as whatever elected officials are there, that they are at the podium together and that they are providing information, answering the questions, specific questions. So, for example, you already have a member of the FBI that is saying this is not a terroristic act, as opposed to we're looking into that. And so a question should be followed up on what was it that made you say that? And so you may have a little bit of walking back. You may have a piece of information that the FBI was in possession of, and so thereby it's not shared with the local law enforcement, and so that should be clarified. Which amazes me that something like that would be said unless they had something very specific to indicate that. And in other words, is there a manifesto? Is there a letter? Is there something in the vehicle that was already captured that was able to give the motivation of this individual to where the FBI can hang their hat on to say this is not being investigated as a terroristic act domestically or internationally, and thereby as a mass attack, the criminal intent, in other words, a murderous act. So I hope there can be some sort of specific information and a question to be asked. Why are there two different motivations being provided here? One that it's emphatic that is a terroristic act, and then one that's emphatic it's not a terroristic act. There seemed to be that there was no room for error there. So I would hope that there may be a clarification to say this is why we said what it is, and this is what it is being investigated as, or I shouldn't have said that, and thereby all options are on the table as to the motivation behind this driver.
And they were all inside the police department for a while, kind of coordinating information, speaking back and forth. So it is interesting that you had those conflicting comments that were made, because you would imagine that that was a discussion that they probably did have. So it'll be interesting to hear the reporters question them on, well, why did you say that it is? Why did you say that it isn't? What sort of evidence does point that way? Now, I've asked you this before, but we know that the suspect in this attack, according to the Associated Press, was killed in a shootout with police. 2 officers were shot. The suspect was shot and killed as well. My question for you, how does it kind of change the investigation when you have a suspect who is alive versus a suspect who is dead? Because I imagine it's a little bit more difficult to get answers if the suspect is no longer alive, but at the same time, you can release more information to the public if the suspect is dead and there's no case going forward, right?
Yeah, so when you have a suspect that's alive, it's always about getting in front of that suspect to do an interview, and then you really get to ask all the questions and then see if it fits the evidence that that crime scene is retrieving. So when you have a suspect that is alive, that suspect is taken into custody, and that suspect can answer. Most likely will, especially of an incident like this, a suspect will be prone to, hey, this is the rationale to my murderous act here, and this is the reason why, etc. And so there is a trove of information that could be obtained that can enlighten not only the investigation going forward for a prosecution, but also to disseminate information that is good for the public. When you have a suspect that is killed or unfortunately would have taken their own life, as we've seen in these mass attacks, that you are now left out open to what is the determination? Are there other individuals that have worked in collaboration with this, and is the public is the public safe? And so there are additional questions that now are left up to the investigators, looking at the scene, looking at what is inside the vehicle, being able to get search warrants conducted, and being able to get into the digital media of this individual to see if this person was in contact with anybody. Are there, as there are some stories going around of possible IEDs, are there IEDs elsewhere? How long was the planning of this act? And so thereby there are questions left to public safety, that an individual has been killed, but that it is not deemed that there's no other safety issues for the general public, especially in the New Orleans area. So these questions that could be asked and taken at face value, combined with the evidence of a suspect who's interviewed, you're now left racing against the clock to say what else is out there, and what have we not uncovered that we otherwise could through an interview.
I imagine that one of the big questions also, once we find out the identity of the person and whether they're actually from New Orleans, would be what made you specifically choose New Orleans? Now, Bourbon Street goes hand in hand with New Orleans. People all over the country and really all over the world are familiar with Bourbon Street. So I assume a question that not only we have, but investigators have is why New Orleans?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. Where is this individual from? Is this individual a local? And if not, that creates a wider net. So how far did this person travel to, especially if they're not from Louisiana? And you know, of course, the FBI being involved is going to be able to execute search warrants wherever they are necessary. But it is important to know to investigators, is this something that is local, that is contained? And if this person traveled from afar, you're exactly right. Why New Orleans as opposed to any other location where there are mass celebrations being celebrated throughout the country?
As far as a manifesto or anything of that nature, if it does exist, is it likely, and this is a hypothetical situation, but I'm hoping you can provide some context here. If there is one, what are the odds that you have police, the FBI, all of them actually tell the public about that now? The suspect, as we know, is deceased, so there's not necessarily any sort of danger to the public unless somebody else was involved. What are the odds that we actually hear not only that a manifesto exists, but if it was, or there was some kind of note, what it actually said?
Yeah, so that's where I think also the question as to why the FBI would say this is not a terroristic act and the locals saying it is, right? The actions are terrible, that somebody targeted a celebration, that there, and so it may lend to more that this is a terrorist act because somebody wanted to create a lot of not only casualty to those present, but then to affect a broader message. And that's ultimately where you get into terrorism related, as opposed to somebody who is saying, okay, I have a grudge and I'm going to hurt this set of people. Um, so with regards to the manifesto, we have seen in past, especially with cases like this that have brought a lot of media attention, that the FBI and law enforcement is less, I would say, open to releasing information of a manifesto, a letter, whether it be found in the vehicle, on the person, or in some cases where individuals have done something either on FaceTime or recorded message on their phone to provide some sort of what is happening inside the mind of this individual. So I would suspect that if something is found readily soon, if it hasn't already have been, that that piece of information would be relayed to the public, but that the specifics would remain close to the vest of investigators until it is suitable. And for whatever reason, law enforcement typically does not like to publish those manifestos or give out that information until a little bit later that they've been able to digest it. And I guess there could be a couple of different reasons. It could be that somebody is exhibiting some sort of rambling and ranting that is irrational, so thereby they don't want the public to simply have it and be able to make their own determinations and assumptions. But if one does exist and has been found, I imagine that piece of information would be provided at the next press conference.
I do have to ask because I know I'm mentioning a lot that the suspect is deceased, of course, confirmed there by the Associated Press that he was killed in a shootout with officers. So when you have a situation where you have a suspect who is alive, the public is normally asked to essentially share any information they have about the person. Is that still kind of the same case when the suspect is no longer alive? Do investigators still want to speak with the public and people who may know him?
Yeah, so even though the suspect, from what we are learning, is deceased, killed in a shootout with law enforcement, we want to know, not we, but the law enforcement community, the powers that be that are investigating this, want to know more about the individual. And so thereby, I imagine there will be a tip line that is provided through the FBI that when they feel it is necessary to release the information, the identity of the suspect, then to be able to get information, especially if this individual is not local. So thereby, they would want to know different parts of his travel. For example, hey, has anybody come in contact with this suspect in the last couple of days? For example, they will be able to determine through social media and other digital media through his footprint, when did this plan start to take place? And so they would want to know um, who this person was in contact with. For example, did this person share with strangers at a restaurant or rest stop or whatever have you, kind of giving this plan. And so you'll only know that by providing a tip line and the identity of this person with a picture to say, if anybody has come in contact with this person in so many days, please contact this number and provide that information. So I imagine, regardless of whether the suspect was alive or deceased, that you want to close the gap on a timeline, and that timeline of when did this plan start to be hashed out to the point of execution. There's a lot of unknown that the FBI and investigators won't be able to fill in until those individuals, tipsters, are calling in to say, hey, I ran into this person, I spoke with this person, et cetera, or this person purchased something that at a local Walmart depot, whatever have you, that I think will be of value to the investigation.
Last question here. And again, you touched on this a bit earlier, but for folks out there, a lot of questions are, where does the investigation overall go from here? Again, you touched on this, but can you kind of go over that again for folks who are watching as we watched the investigation play out. We are just hours from the incident happening here. It happened about 5 hours ago. So a lot of information coming in, and the investigation is basically in its infant stage at this point. So what is next?
Yeah, so first and foremost, they want to determine that the public is safe, and they want to ensure that this person is not working in conjunction with anybody else of like-minded individuals. So that is key in order to give the public a sense, a sigh of relief that, hey, even though that section of New Orleans is closed off because it is a crime scene, that everywhere else you may continue on with your celebrations, because we believe through our investigation that the suspect is deceased, was not working with anybody else, that we have executed necessary search warrants, for example, at the residence, business, wherever that person has been. And now the investigation is continuing into the motivation of this individual and so forth. I believe that it is crucial, whatever it is in that vehicle, within the home or apartment, wherever that person's resided, that a search warrant will be executed, and that will, if they have IEDs or anything that's resembled of such in and around the vehicle, that they can probably believe that same danger exists wherever this person may reside. Is it possible that this person is residing with other family members or friends that could be in potential danger, not knowing what is inside the home? So all these things, first and foremost, from a public safety standpoint, have to be investigated, and then continue on with the motivation, et cetera, of why this individual did what he did today.
There are so many questions. I'm waiting, of course, as everyone is, to find out more about who the suspect is, their identity, their background, their information, where they went to school. I mean, there's so many questions, and we're hopeful that police investigators in general will release some of that information later on today during that news conference that's set to take place in just about 2 hours. Scott Duffy, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Is there anything else you want to add before I let you go?
That I believe the FBI and our local law enforcement partners will be on the same page, that the motivation is important, but ultimately the public safety. And as horrible as it is, our prayers are with those who are out doing what everybody else was doing, celebrating a new year. And may peace be brought to them, to their surviving family members and friends. And yet, as we enter into 2025, that we will see less and less violence in the United States and abroad.
Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. A sad situation developing here on the first day of 2025. Thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you, Josh.
And I do want to take you back out to this video of the scene that we do have. This is a live look from a distance. We have so many different cameras that are showing this active scene, and it is likely to be active for quite a while. That is over at Canal Street at Bourbon Street, which, if you've ever heard of New Orleans goes hand in hand with Bourbon Street. It is the most popular road there, and it's where a lot of tourists do spend a lot of time. Now, the hotels, we're told, in that area were actually evacuated at one point afterward. It's not clear how many hotels were evacuated, how many people we're talking about, but that is just one aspect of the situation, is that those folks who were in those hotels, which is, again, a popular tourist destination, they are allowed back inside to gather their things. We also saw some of the video from outside the police department earlier on today as people were essentially being shuffled away. They were being moved out of that location. We also heard from the police commissioner that folks are urged to avoid really that entire area here. We're talking Bourbon Street as well as other nearby streets all throughout the day today as crews are working that investigation. Again, so much going on here and still so much left to figure out. But investigators telling us here that at least 10 people are dead and more than 30 others injured and rushed to hospitals for treatment. They have varying degrees of injuries. So at this point, we don't know the severity of all of their injuries. That is just something that is left to figure out. We could learn more during that news conference that is set to take place at 12 p.m. Eastern time. That is 11 a.m. local time here, as well as 9 a.m. if you are on Pacific time. We'll make sure to bring all of that to you here on Live Now from Fox as it does come in. My producer Carla just sending me this statement that was released by NOLA over there in New Orleans. They say that families of victims arriving at the University Medical Center are being asked to go to the conference center there on the first floor across from Tower 2. That is the midpoint of the hospital. That is the family reunification information on this incident here on Bourbon Street. So once we get just a little bit more information about that, we'll let you know. But if you are watching from that area, just know that that is the location that you are supposed to go to be reunited with your family members who could be there at the hospital. We are going to head to a quick 2-minute commercial break now at 9:43 on the East Coast and 6:43 on the West Coast.